This episode of On the Bookshelf, featuring Larry Leavitt, is sponsored by the Winthrop Book Depot and Cafe, located at 11 Somerset Avenue in Winthrop, Massachusetts. Welcome once again to On the Bookshelf. I'm Pete Solomon. Go into any bookstore or library and you'll see shelves of crime novels, and true crime is extremely popular. In this area, true crime that takes place in Boston literally flies off the shelf. There are so many names, so many individuals, so many books that have ultimately been made into movies. But there's a name you may not know, and that's the name of Buddy McLean. But author Larry Leavitt has created a fascinating book about an individual not well known, but remembered by the people he crossed paths with. We learn about Buddy McLean from the author.
It is July 9th, 1949. It was a sweltering hot morning at the Charlestown Navy Yard. The sun was just beginning to rise over Boston Harbor. An inexperienced New Hampshire native, Lieutenant Michael Ross, was a day's base officer. Sweat poured through his shirt despite the early morning hour. He was irritated as he worked on the reports that ruined his plans to spend the day with his girlfriend at nearby Revere Beach. He continued to wipe the sweat from his brow between strokes of his pen. What a rotten place to be at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning in July, Ross thought as he grabbed his pen and clipboard and began the walk from his office to the infirmary. He had to interview 4 sailors recovering from the battering they had received the previous night at the Alibi Club in Charlestown. The Alibi was a hotspot nightclub located on Main Street just outside Charlestown's action-packed city square. The club and the square were within walking distance of the Navy Yard. Ross entered the room where the 4 were lying in bed side by side. Their injuries were extreme. 2 concussions, 1 broken nose and jaw, several bad facial and neck lacerations, the result of being launched through the passenger side window of a parked Oldsmobile. In addition, there were a few fractured ribs, a broken clavicle, a sprained ankle, and numerous cuts and bruises. The attending physician merely nodded when Ross asked permission to interview the victims. Ross woke the sailors and demanded to be informed. "Okay, tell me right now, what the hell happened to you guys?" The men tried to look at each other but remained mute. The superior warned, "You better speak up and fast or you'll never leave this yard for the rest of your days in the Navy." With his chin resting on his chest and his eyes looking at his hands, one sailor spoke up and admitted, "Some guy in the bar beat the crap out of us." The officer's jaw dropped as he asked, "One guy?" The pen and clipboard cluttered as they bounced off the floor. The sailor tried to nod, "Yes, Lieutenant, one guy, but I never seen anyone like him. He was strong, fast, and tough as a nickel steak." It took Ross a moment to comprehend, and then he asked the 4 against 1, "And you guys ended up here? How was that possible?" The sailor, apparently the spokesman of the group, replied meekly, "It started as a one-on-one fight outside the club. Sonny was totally overmatched, so we tried to break it up. Next thing you know, we're all fighting him, but he wouldn't go down. I never saw anyone so tough. Then he started getting in some shots, and it's going back and forth, and finally he wore us down. Then he keeps going, we ended up here." "Wore you down? What? Were you guys falling down drunk?" "Yes, sir, we were all drunk, but not that bad. This kid was unbelievable. I swear to Christ." "Kid? Was he big? Did you get this kid's name?" inquired the officer. The sailor said, "No, sir. He's young and he was hanging with some longshoreman. I think he's from Somerville and someone might have called him Buddy." The sailor slamming fireball who single-handedly put 4 men in a hospital bed was James J. Buddy McLean. He was a longshoreman from Somerville, a blue-collar, hard-scrabble municipality a bit north of Boston. At the time, Buddy McLean was becoming well known throughout Greater Boston as a talented street fighter. His hometown was the most densely populated city in New England. Somerville has a long history of great high school basketball team, but it was also home to many dangerous street toughs who liked starting trouble and picking fights. People residing in Somerville were brought up to be competitive, assertive, and aggressive. At 19 years old, Buddy McLean had already proven himself to be the best puncher in Somerville, where even the strong influence of the heavily attended Catholic Church was barely able to contain the fierce, bloodthirsty spirit of the predominantly Irish and Italian parish. Now, even at that age, his reputation as a terrific street fighter was beginning to spread throughout the area. Without seeking recognition, the young, unassuming, physically fit, baby-faced Irishman began his ascension to the title, toughest guy around. A product of his own hard-hitting East Somerville environment, he fought to get by in a location where violence was a common occurrence. As he became more celebrated, the challenges accelerated. It was also about this time that the young scrapper organized a few of his friends into a makeshift crew to pilfer assorted goods from several Boston ship docks. The cohorts not only respected, but they idolized McLean. On top of that, they had absolute trust and loyalty to him. Eventually, he built a larger following. Years later, a Boston newspaper writer would label them the Winter Hill Gang.
Larry Leavitt, thank you very much for joining us tonight and
welcome.
introducing us to James J. Buddy McLean. How old were you when you first heard your folks talking about him?
I was about 5 years old. My dad started telling me stories.
Now, you have an interesting background. I understand this is your first book.
It is.
But you grew up in Everett and Peabody. You went to Peabody High, where I guess your classmates remember you as a pretty good pitcher. You took your spikes and glove to Salem State. You spent a little time as a teamster.
Yep.
You've been an educator, a businessman since 1983. You've had a fitness center. And it took you 5 years to research this book. As you look back across your life, can you imagine yourself as a young person growing up to write a book?
At the beginning, probably no. But once those books about Whitey Bulger started coming out, and people like him, some of his friends, I was anxiously awaiting a book to come out about Buddy McLean because I thought the story was so great. And then when it didn't happen, I asked my dad, I go, what do you think? And he said, who better to write about? Absolutely, go ahead and do it.
One of the interesting things about the book is, so many times you read a biography and it begins with something, as yours did, an event, and then it backs up and it moves in chronological order. The individual who's being written about is born and grows up and then moves into whatever sphere he reaches. But yours is different. It's told in anecdotal form. The people that cross paths with Buddy McLean. And the interviews, while the research, as we said, 5 years of research must have been challenging, must have been fun trading stories with the people that you interviewed.
Oh, absolutely. To me, it was like an immensely enjoyable hobby. I loved it the whole time. And, you know, because of that, I made a lot of nice friends.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jerry Angulo, of course, was well known for running the North End as the boss of the mob there. And you tell us about a point where he's telling some of his people about Buddy McLean, and he says, and I'm quoting you here, respected, loved, and feared all at the same time. Loved and feared. Is that where you got the title?
That's part of it, I'd say, yeah. It took quite a while to come up with a title for the book. There was a lot of people feeding me ideas and so on and so forth. And some of them I liked, so I used them as titles and chapters later on.
The book talks about Buddy as a young man. And as you suggested, he was not only tough, but he was in great physical condition. He was a terrific athlete, did a little boxing. The Everett football coaches saw him in the park and really wished he could remain in school and play for them.
Yeah.
At your fitness facility, there's the Winter Hill workout.
Yes, it is.
What is the Winter Hill workout?
It's basically his type of a workout without the long distance running.
Sure.
And with Buddy McLean, it was all about getting your heart rate up to a certain extent where you're pretty much exhausted, but now you're doing strength training to go with it. So let's say your heart rate is over 120 beats a minute. He's going to get down and do push-ups at that point, and then he's going to get on his back and bang out ab crunches. And then he'll take a little break, get a sip of water, and get right back in there. He hit that punching bag as fast and as hard as he could, you know, like it would be a real fight.
Mm-hmm. Talk about, if you would, what Somerville was like in the 40s and 50s.
Well, it was, the population was 120,000. You know, you had all those triple deckers,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of blue collar workers, of course, and I don't know how many churches they had. And, you know, you were brought up to go to church. It was mainly Italian and Irish.
Sure.
And bars on every corner and sub shops and whatnot. But the kids were very, very aggressive, competitive athletes, like I mentioned in the first chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd fight at the drop of a hat. They really would. And there was a lot of wise guys hanging around.
I have read that at these times, Somerville had the greatest population per square yard
Most
or acre.
densely populated city in the United States at the time. Yeah.
So you had to be tough to hold your own there,
Oh,
right?
it was going to happen. Yeah.
Now, Buddy got a job with the Teamsters when he was 13 years old.
Yes.
And he wasn't much older when he learned to drive a truck.
Exactly.
He was smart and resourceful.
Yeah. He was surrounded by great guys too. It was during World War II, so there was a lack of men working age. So they'd go after the younger kids, and he was fortunate enough to get in. And it was unloading and reloading and sweeping out trailers, and he did that, and he was making pretty good money doing it. And the guys down there took a liking to him, and they said to him, "Hey, you want to learn how to drive trucks?" So when he was about 14, 15 years old, and he could reach the pedals comfortably, he started doing that in the yard, backing them up, parking them. You know, he was pretty lucky that these guys took that interest.
Sure. But throughout the book, one of the things we realize is he had a wonderful work ethic.
Yes, yeah. Took a lot of pride in it. He always worked very methodical but fast, and he always looked at it as they're paying me to work out.
There are many sides to Buddy McLean. You talk about how physically tough he was, how aggressive he was. He had great compassion. He had great people skills. But also, there was a dark side of him, too. And it's easy to forget as we hear how people feel about him, how he touched people throughout his community, that he was involved in some pretty shady things, even at an early age.
Yeah, he with Buddy, it was all about respect. And he couldn't stand it because he would show respect, but if you didn't give it back, you were in dire straits. He was gonna settle it pretty quick. And if he was drinking, the Irish temper would come out a little bit. So you wanted to keep your distance at that point. As far as, you know, some of the things that he got into, well, he learned that down on the docks because everybody else was doing it.
Sure.
And they introduced it to him, and he saw how easy it was and how lucrative it could be. So, you know, and times were tough back in those days. He kind of fell into it.
He met his wife in 1944.
Yeah.
And I know you spent time with her before her passing.
We became good friends.
That's
Jean
an
and I.
amazing love story between those two. isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, she was walking down Walnut Street in Somerville after school one day, and he's hanging there with his buddies, Howie went to John Hurley, and Martin Pushka Murphy, and she came walking by, and he said hello, and that started it.
I just wanted to digress for a second because you talk about Howie Winter. People presume that Whitey Bulger created the Winter Hill Gang. That's not true.
Not true at all. He was actually the third boss. Buddy started it, and it was all just him and his friends down there on the docks. Later on, they hijacked trailers, and then after that, they got into bookmaking and stuff like that. But it was a small little crew, working class guys. They all had nice jobs, either in the Teamsters Union or the Longshoremen's Union, and that was it. And it just became bigger and more powerful.
And yet, he was great to the people around him. When he saw somebody that needed his help, he was there. There's this strange dichotomy. There's the side of him that falls in with a criminal element, and this side of him that's just a good neighbor, smart. He could have been a great businessman if he'd moved in that direction.
Yeah, you're right.
Great two sides to a remarkable character.
Yeah, unique individual. Yeah, you said it all.
There are so many larger-than-life characters in this book. You write about the Anchulos, you write about Raymond Patriarca, you write about the McLaughlin brothers, who are certainly prominent in the book.
Yeah.
Is there something special about the Boston area that breeds these guys?
Maybe it's the environment, the tough area, and the pride in the neighborhood, and the work ethic. But you know, they all have those vicious tempers that they can get violent in a second. And I don't know what it's like around the rest of the country, but you know, you look at the great fighters that we've had in this area. You know, the Rocky Marciano types and Marvin Hagler from this area, and there's so many guys. You know, McLean was like that. He worked out harder than all of them.
Rocky Marciano, of course, the only undefeated heavyweight champion in the history of the sport, and yet the people that knew Buddy McLean compared the two, and so that if he had directed himself into boxing, he could have been a great boxer.
That's a nice conversation to have, and I don't know who would win one way or the other. It's just that, these people idolized him.
Sure. Yeah, that's one of the great things about sports, though. You can sort of create these situations, who would beat who, and
Yeah, I'm like that to this day.
Sure.
I think that Babe Ruth would be a great baseball player right now.
I'm sure you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, we should note, Buddy climbed into the ring at Dilboy Field.
Yeah.
With a memorable fight. Maybe you could describe a little bit of that.
The first two fights were quick, 1 minute first round knockouts.
Mm-hmm.
Then he gets in there with a kid from Roxbury who was very polished, experienced fighter. I didn't know his name. I couldn't get it. I tried. And it went to 3 rounds. And towards the end, Buddy actually knocked him out at the bell, but it turned into a free-for-all. And the referee wanted Buddy to lose the fight, disqualified,
Sure.
because he actually grabbed the guy by the throat and punched him in the face and knocked him out. This was after the guy uppercutted him in the groin, but and then
Not exactly the Marquis of Queensberry rules.
yeah, you're right. It almost turned into a riot because everybody down there was rooting for Buddy, and they just called it a draw.
Sure. And they had to sneak those guys out of there, didn't they?
And they had their cops from Arlington, Medford, and Cambridge come in just to keep things under control.
And not to dwell on this, but except it's interesting. He took a few professional fighters down in bar fights.
Oh yeah, he did. The biggest fight and the toughest fight Buddy had in the book is the Joe DeAngelis fight. Mm-hmm. Joe DeAngelis was a great fighter from the Boston area. He had beaten Marciano in the National Golden Gloves tournament. Now, DeAngelis was a tall, rangy, powerful guy, but a real sharpshooter with his hands. He could pinpoint his punches. And they said he was the best fighter Marciano ever fight, including as a pro.
Sure.
Now, the only reason why DeAngelis didn't turn pro, I guess he had a heart condition, so he wasn't allowed to do that. Yeah. But in that fight, supposedly, they told me it took place down the Alibi Club. There was a lot of people betting on it that night, and Buddy took a brutal beating, but DeAngelis couldn't knock him out, and then DeAngelis got tired, and here comes Buddy McLean.
And then DeAngelis shows great respect for him. There's a mutuality of respect after the fight is over.
I don't know what happened so much about that, but the reason why I found out about this story is Mike DeAngelis, Joe's brother, worked with my father. And it was Mike that told my dad the story of what happened. And then, of course, my dad tells me and my brothers.
And that's why your dad probably thought you were the ideal guy to write this book?
Maybe.
a lot of conversations in your household about that before you started?
Yeah, every once in a while, but it wasn't just that. We talked about sports and everything else. But, yeah, Buddy McLean did come up a lot.
We can't get away from Buddy's activities without talking about his best friend and mentor, Joe McDonald. Could you talk a little bit about him?
Yeah. Buddy had a problem with the longshoreman down on the docks when he first started. He was about 17 years old, and he got beat up. They ganged up on him, and so Buddy decided. There was actually another guy that told him you should join the line and put on some size and strength. So Buddy's down there, but he's kind of spinning his wheels. He doesn't really know what to do, how to work out. And Joe McDonald, home from World War II, serving over in Japan. And he's working out down there, and he just kind of walked up to Buddy, introduced himself, and he said, "You want to work out?" And after that, he took him under his wing, and he really polished him as a fighter. And he gave him, more of a work ethic at the time. He said, "This is what you got to do every day." And Buddy McLean, he has that work ethic. He's going to follow McDonald to a T.
But it should be noted that at different times, both McDonald and Buddy were incarcerated.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, they were no angels by any means. No, I call them opportunists. If something came along and they thought it was a low risk, they would do it. And Joe McDonald, he'd study it. If he was going to rob that bank, he'd be there for a few weeks, casing it out. And he was a real smart guy. Like I mentioned in the book, he could fix anything. Machinery, anything around the house that needed to be fixed, your washing machine, whatever, he could do it. So, and he was a very patient guy, real quiet guy, small. But they said extremely dangerous, and they actually consider him the real boss of Winter Hill.
Talk about low risk. High risk is the way Buddy drove his car at about 100 miles an hour. Could we talk about that story?
Yeah, what a daredevil. Yeah, and then there was one time he was on a motorcycle. He was about 16 at the time, and he takes over the Craigie Bridge as it's rising up on the McGrath O'Brien Highway, and he takes off and flies over the bridge as it's going up, and boats are coming under, and he lands on the Cambridge side of the bridge. Jean was all mad at him. She says, "I'll never get on that bike with you, you crazy bastard."
But beyond that, Jean was a great wife, and they raised a wonderful family.
Oh yeah, 4 kids, 2 boys, 2 girls. Yep. The oldest son, Jimmy, he's no longer with us, but Michael and I are good friends, and Lee and Kelly, great girls. I'm friendly with all of them too, and their kids, and Bobby Caggiano, Lee's husband.
Sure.
Great guy, yeah.
And do they have a real sense of what their father was about, not only physically, but what he was involved in?
Well, put it this way. When they were kids, they knew nothing about the Winter Hill Gang, all the dealings that were going. They didn't even know about the gang war that was going to go on later on. Buddy kept it away from them. He didn't want them to be worried. He didn't want them to get involved in anything like that. They were young, and he didn't want them to be scared. They just knew that he drove a truck.
Yeah.
They knew that. And then every once in a while, something would come home that fell off the truck. And then they'd share it with all the people in the neighborhood.
You touched on the gang war. We're talking about the Irish gang war between Somerville and the guys from Charlestown, and 60 guys were killed.
Yeah, over the course of about 6-7 years, yeah.
Could you tell us how it started?
Yeah, it was Labor Day weekend, 1961, up in Salisbury Beach. And a bunch of Somerville folks and a few Charlestown guys are up there having a nice party going. And the youngest of the McLaughlin brothers, Georgie, he got drunk and he made an advance on a Somerville woman. He touched her inappropriately, and the husband stepped in, and the husband's friend stepped in, and a brawl takes place in the kitchen, and somebody smashed him over the head with a whiskey bottle, and they thought they killed him, but they hadn't, and they rolled him up in a carpet, and they drove him off and dumped him on Anna Jake's front lawn. It's the hospital in Newburyport, and they left him there. They go home to Somerville and tell Buddy about it, and Buddy says, "You guys got to leave right now." These 2 guys owned the Capitol Bar. They were also bookmakers under Buddy, and so they took off, and it all fell on Buddy's lap after that.
But you touched on something interesting a few minutes ago when you talked about respect. It's all about respect, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it really is.
This is how.
As far as he was concerned.
Oh, sure.
And he's the most generous person you're ever going to meet. But yeah, never lie to him. Always respect him, and then you're all set as far as he's concerned.
The stories are legendary. For instance, the story when he goes to upstate New York, and I don't want to spoil the book for people that are going to read it, but maybe you could touch out on the outsides of it and talk about how he brought down the toughest guy in Albany.
Yeah, he was delivering something up there at the Albany terminal, and this guy, he was like a mafia type. He wanted to charge him an export fee. All right, you can drop stuff off, but if you're taking stuff out, you got to pay me. And Buddy refused to pay, so they flattened his tires when he wasn't looking. He was having lunch in a diner. So the next time out, Buddy was ready to go. And when the guy confronted him again, there was a big issue, and 3 big thugs surrounded Buddy, but Howie was there with him with a baseball bat and a pistol, and said to them, "You can all fight him, but one at a time." And so they sent the biggest guy after Buddy, which that ended in about 3 or 4 punches. And then the brother came in, and he was taken care of pretty fast too. And then as far as that goes, the boss was afraid, and he wanted to back off, and Buddy intimidated him after that and made sure that it didn't happen again. And then that incident got back to Jimmy Hoffa, who was so proud of Buddy McLean for doing that. And then there was a big get-together a few weeks later down in Dorchester. It was a union party, and Hoffa couldn't wait to meet Buddy McLean that day. And I even had a picture.
There's a picture in the book, sure.
Yeah, Jimmy Hoffa signed it.
We were speculating a few minutes ago about athletes. Let's speculate about something else for just a second, Larry. Buddy, as we said, was smart, and he was resourceful. He could have used his athleticism to wind up going to college.
Oh, yeah.
I know during the war, times were tough and money was hard to come by, but he could have apparently played college football with the skills that he showed. He certainly could have run a legitimate business with the business acumen that he showed. If we could speculate, what do you think how he would have wound up if he'd gone straight?
Well, you know what? There was one point, and it was right before the gang war started. Buddy had those thoughts. He was now becoming more of a family man. and he wanted to get away from the fighting and the brawling in the bars, and he just wanted to get away from all the illegal activities. He wanted to own a legitimate business, or maybe a couple of them. He was thinking about opening a place like Kelly's Roast Beef, but up in Hampton Beach or up in Salisbury Beach. And he thought he might do that and maybe have a bar up there at the same time. And I think he would have had a gold mine if he had done it. One of the things that prevented it was Jean didn't like going to the beach. And she says, you can go if you want, but I'm staying here. So, you know, he said that someday he was going to do it, but then that gang war started and he got involved in that, and that nixed all those plans.
I'm going to bring up a question that I'm absolutely sure you've been asked by other people, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask you now. So many people from this era and from this area have become lionized. Movies have been made about them. Books have been written about them. Why don't we know more about Buddy McLean? Why isn't his story more universal?
I don't know why. The things I think about maybe is that he died young, and then time passed and no books were written back in those days. So memories, maybe they start to fade. All of a sudden, Whitey's coming along and he's becoming more of a target. And then, of course, Howie Carr jumped all over that.
Sure.
And he made that a real big deal. Howie did a great job. And Howie was doing more like a current events kind of crime thing. And by that time, you know, Buddy was pretty much a forgotten guy.
Sure.
Except by the old timers that still remembered him. And of course, I remembered the stories.
35 years old. He passed away. He was slain when he was 35.
Yeah.
He crammed a lot of living into 35 years, didn't
I
he?
say that all the time, too. He did a whole lot of living, yeah.
Interesting. Now, Buddy McLean couldn't survive now, could he? In this climate, there are no secrets. Things are out there. These days are over, aren't they?
Yeah, as far as the fighting goes, things like that, he'd be looking at all kinds of lawsuits coming at him. And Buddy McLean was a unique guy. They thought, and it was one lawyer that I interviewed, he said that, I don't know if McLean could have prevented it, but he said, once he died, Greater Boston started to crumble due to the infiltration of street drugs. And he thought that McLean would not tolerate that. And he's not sure if he could have stopped it. Remember, Buddy's good friend, Sal Sperlinga, was murdered by a drug dealer because Sal didn't want him dealing drugs outside his office. Sure. But the bad guys were definitely leery of Buddy McLean, and Buddy was very smart. So it would be interesting to see what would have happened if he had stayed. One thing's for sure is that Whitey and Stevie Fleming, they never would have become as prominent as they did if Buddy had survived.
Is it a personality thing? How come those guys sort of rose to the top?
Well, you knew that they were FBI informants.
Right.
So behind Howie Winter's back and the other guys, Jerry Angiulo and this and that, they were ratting them out to the FBI. And Buddy was pretty street savvy, and he probably wouldn't have trusted them. Like Joe McDonald never trusted those guys. And I'm sure that these guys really would think twice about pulling anything under Buddy McLean.
I'm not suggesting for a moment that there isn't criminality now. I'm just suggesting that it was different then. It was more man-on-man. It was more physical. It was more about respect.
Yeah.
And it was just a different era.
Yeah.
But now it's become sort of a romanticized story, hasn't it?
It has. You're right. Yeah. They're not. They don't want to settle it with their fists anymore. Yeah, they'll shoot you from down the street. You know, Buddy would use a pistol.
Your book has been very successful. It's generated a lot of talk. Now you have one book under your belt. Do you have an idea for another one down the road?
Well, there's been a few suggestions. One, I'm learning how to write a screenplay based on this.
Oh, this would make a great movie.
I think it would. So I'm contemplating that. And then I also thought about it would kind of be a prequel, but writing the life story of Joe McDonald might not be a bad thing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Larry Leavitt, we certainly appreciate the opportunity to get to meet you and talk about a fascinating subject. Your book is compelling, and we wish you all the best. Thanks again.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate that.
Okay. And thank you for joining us. For Larry Leavitt, I'm Pete Solomon. We'll see you next time on the Bookshelf. This episode of On the Bookshelf, featuring Larry Leavitt, was sponsored by the Winthrop Book Depot and Cafe, located at 11 Somerset Avenue in Winthrop, Massachusetts.